It's on. Today, direct from Serbia and points west. In fact, Eastern is the direction we want to think about. There we are. So today, direct from Serbia is Dr. Urosevic, who you can see the Serbian spelling there with the interesting kratkoyas over the different parts of the... So in any event, Dr. Urosevic and I have been working together for about 3 years, and she is doing, did her work undergrad at Wisconsin, has been in the psychology department here for quite a while, and is going to be going out to our VA to continue work. She's a great friend and a lot of fun, and I will not take any more of her time.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jensen, for that great introduction, and thank you all for coming. I tend to sometimes talk low, especially in front of large crowds. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. So as the title suggests, I will be presenting some data both from graduate school, from UW-Madison, and from the most recent years of work I've been doing here at the University of Minnesota on reward system dysregulation of bipolar disorders, and specifically focusing on adolescence as a developmental period where there's significant maturational changes happening to the system, and trying to see if there is any sort of deviations in how the system develops in adolescents who already exhibit bipolar symptoms. But before I go into the theoretical framework and present you with the data, I always like to start with a quote, and I really like this quote from Katie Radfield Jamieson, who's a scientist, an author, and also someone who suffers from bipolar I disorder. In her autobiography, An Unquiet Mind, she describes her manic episodes in the following way. My classwork during these Calvinized periods seemed very straightforward, and I found examinations, laboratory work, and papers almost absurdly easy during the weeks that the high-flying times would last. I would also become immersed in a variety of political and social causes. But then, as night inevitably goes after the day, my mood would crash, and my mind would grind to a halt. I lost all interest in my schoolwork, friends, reading, wandering, and daydreaming. The reason I really like this quote is because I think it nicely describes a personal experience of somebody who's going from both these extremes of bipolar disorder. So the high-flying, galvanized times of high energy, increased goal-directed activity, whether it's in work or social interactions or social causes. And then at the same time, the same person can experience the complete opposite of that. So a time where they lose all interest and experience anhedonia, have low energy, are lethargic, and maybe are not engaging with the world much at all. So if we look at the full spectrum of bipolar diagnosis, so including the less severe forms of cyclothymia and bipolar disorder not otherwise specified, according to the World Health Organization survey, about 5% of the world will suffer during their lifetime with one of these diagnoses. There are similar rates in the US. And then also we have long-standing hypothesis that this is a progressive illness. So going all the way back to Kraepelin times, there was a hypothesis that individuals progress to more severe symptoms as the illness goes on. There is also very little data to test that hypothesis until very recently, or very little longitudinal standardized data that would follow people with less severe conditions and see whether this progression actually happens. Also, more recently, we have had controversy about pediatric bipolar disorder, and I'm going to make a claim that maybe some people don't agree, that the data is converging that this is a common, pediatric onset is common. And reason I say that is, for example, one of the studies, the STEP-BD multi-site study that had thousands of patients with bipolar disorder. When they looked at the first 1,000 patients enrolled, about 2/3 of them reported onset of symptoms before age 18. This is suggesting this is common. you can say it's retrospective and we need more prospective data. But one thing that was clear is that this early age of onset was linked with worsening course or worse prognosis. They were more likely to have more frequent episodes, they were reporting higher suicidality, and they had higher rates of comorbidity with other psychiatric illnesses. So there seems to be something important about the pediatric onset of this illness. And it's really important because even if it's adult onset, we know that bipolar disorder is already characterized with high comorbidity. So looking over a lifetime, pretty much almost all individuals with bipolar disorder will experience at least one other psychiatric illness. Most common are anxiety disorders and substance use disorders, and there is a very high risk of suicide. And in particular, there's a very high risk of suicide completion, either if looking at victims of suicides who have disproportionate numbers of them have had bipolar disorder diagnosis, or if we look at lethality ratio, so the percentage of people who attempt in a year versus the percentage of people who complete in a year with this diagnosis. And I have here that's highly heritable. So in some ways, we have known the highest risks for who will develop the disorder. It's been family history of an illness, but we need to understand more about it. We need to know something that would describe what is going on that will explain both poles of the illness, so both the bipolar depression with anhedonia and lack of energy, and the high-flying times of mania. We also need a theoretical model that will let us know who is at risk for this more progressive worsening course, and hopefully a theoretical model that can give us insight into why pediatric onset seems to be linked to a worsening course. So going back all the way to UW-Madison days, I've been working from a theoretical perspective that actually originated in Minnesota. The reward system or behavioral approach system dysregulation model of bipolar illness that I would like to make a claim can help us give answers to some of these questions. So the behavioral approach system is a behavioral motivational system that as its function has to get an individual in touch with a reward, so to facilitate approaching rewards in our environment. And the Pugh and colleagues here in Minnesota proposed in the 80s that this system is dysregulated in bipolar disorder. And what they meant by that is that there are extreme fluctuations in its activity, where BAS hyperactivation leads to manic symptoms, where a person is going after all kinds of rewards and often with disregard for consequences. And the flip side of it is BAS hypoactivation or shutdown, where they just seem to lose all interest. Moreover, what's been proposed to be inherited is this BAS hypersensitivity or hyperreactivity to environment, and especially environmental cues signaling rewards. So this is a picture that talks a little bit about neurobiology. That comes from an article by Lemoal, talk about difficult names. So I like this figure because even though as its center it has dopaminergic projections from ventral tegmental area to ventral striatum and nucleus accumbens in particular, and bidirectional connections between the ventral striatum and prefrontal cortical areas. It also highlights that in the brain, systems don't exist alone, and they are not in vacuum, so there's a lot of interactions with other important systems. So I think, even though maybe I won't be talking as far as empirically about this, this is something in my future work I would like to explore. So what are the empirical data I will be presenting today are going to focus on three questions. First, I'm going to present some data from UW-Madison using young adults and looking at whether there is actual evidence for this BAS hypersensitivity among individuals with bipolar diagnosis. Then I will be looking at some data to see does BAS hypersensitivity or early age of onset predict conversion from less severe diagnosis to bipolar I, so full-blown mania onset, when we look at it longitudinally and have structured assessments repeated over time. And the last question I will be focusing on is basically looking what happens with the early age of onset of bipolar symptoms, and does that onset disrupt the normative maturation of the BAS or reward system. So focusing first on the first question, at UW-Madison, we screened over 14,000 individuals in the community with a self-report questionnaire, the General Behavioral Inventory, to get individuals at high risk for bipolar disorder, as well as individuals at low risk for any affective disorders, both depression and bipolar. Then over 1,000 of them were invited into the lab, and we did a semi-structured diagnostic interviews to assess for any lifetime history of psychiatric disorders based on DSM-4, which was the only one at that time. And this procedure yielded a final sample of 207 participants. 101 had either bipolar II or cyclothymia or bipolar NOS diagnosis. We purposely excluded individuals who had bipolar I because the goal of the project was to see who converts to a more severe illness, so we did not want to include individuals who already had bipolar I or have had a history of manic episode, which is the main difference between the groups. And then we also had 106 controls that were matched on age, race, gender, and socioeconomic status of their families of origin. So as one of the most common self-report measures of BAS sensitivity, that's the BIS-BAS scales, or the BAS subscales of this instrument. The BAS subscales consist of 3 subscales: the BAS drive, the BAS fun-seeking, and BAS reward responsiveness. The factor structure of these subscales has been confirmed both in pediatric and adult populations. And what's also nice about this questionnaire is there is some twin study data to suggest that at least a third of the variance seems to be due to heritable factors. So what BAS drive gets at is sort of the persistence of pursuit of rewards. So how likely is the person to keep persisting to get to rewards? The BAS fun-seeking overlaps with sort of sensation-seeking, so seeking of fun or novel experiences. And the BAS reward responsiveness is more about the hedonic response once you actually have attained rewards. These subscales have good psychometric properties, and they have good construct validity, both when looking at behavioral measures and some psychophysiological measures of BAS functioning. So what we saw in that UW-Madison sample is that when we looked at the composite score, that's like a total score of 3 subscales, is the bipolar group had higher BAS total scores than controls, but they did not differ in their behavioral inhibition sensitivity score, or basically their sensitivity to threat. So it seemed to be specific to reward. And when we looked at the subscales, that difference was really being driven by the BAS drive and BAS fun-seeking subscales. So the persistence of the goal pursuit and the sort of sensation-seeking aspects of it. But a lot of people have issues with self-report. So what about if we do some other kind of a measure of BAS sensitivity? So we invited right-handed individuals from that larger sample, a subset of them, so 41 in the bipolar group and 53 in the control group. And we had them complete what we told them is a word game, because saying to someone you're going to do anagrams does not sound exciting. And basically what they were told, they were going to solve word puzzles in order to win money. There were both punishment and reward trials. In punishment trials, they were trying to solve anagrams to avoid losing money. And in reward trials, they were trying to solve anagrams to win money. There were 3 difficulty conditions: easy, medium, and hard. And the difficulty of anagrams was based both on pilot data and prior literature. And as you can probably tell from examples, easy were super easy, and difficult ones were actually meant to be the kind where most of the times they will not be solving them correctly in the time allotted. And just in case somebody's wondering, that's OASIS. So we were recording. Sorry if I spoiled it for someone. The EEG was recorded throughout the task, but we really focused on the 7 seconds after they saw a cue telling them what kind of a trial it's going to be. So is it going to be easy, medium, or hard, and whether it's going to be reward or punishment, but before they saw the anagram. So they had the fixation cross for 7 seconds, and we focused on that period of EEG recording, calculated power within alpha range, and then calculated a relative frontal asymmetry index that looks at F8 and F7 electrodes and the difference between them. The reason why we looked at this measure is that in the literature it has been proposed as one of the psychophysiological measures of the BAS activity. So what did we find? It was a three-way interaction, so those are hard to explain, so I'll do my best. But as you can tell, if I can use the pointer, so these are the controls, or people without affective disorder. And they have sort of the inverted U shape that you would kind of expect. When it's super easy, they don't get super activated. When it's slightly more challenging but doable, that's when the relative left frontal activity increases, or EG activity increases. And when they get so hard that 90% of the times they're failing, it goes down. That pattern is also seen for the punishment trials in the bipolar individuals, but not for the reward trials. So in the reward trials, their relative left frontal asymmetry continued to be high, even though they were failing just as much. So they were not performing any better on this task than controls. So this would be another way to kind of say that psychophysiological measure was giving us evidence for persistence to pursue goals or rewards, even when they're becoming very difficult and challenging. We're not the only lab that was looking at this at the time or since then. Since then, there's been even more evidence for BAS hypersensitivity using neuroimaging and using also some behavioral measures. So now focusing on the second question, does this BAS hypersensitivity or early age of onset actually predict who will go on to have a more progressive course? So for the purposes of these analysis, we combined the data between UW-Madison and the sort of sister site, Temple University, with Lauren Alloy as a PI. And this gave us 201 participants with either bipolar II, which actually majority of them had, 144 of them, or cyclothymia bipolar NOS diagnosis. At the time of the start of the study, there were 18 to 24, slightly more women than men, predominantly Caucasian, but with fairly good representation of minorities. And the average age of onset was about age 13. So, adolescent period. But we followed them for 4.5 years on average. And what we did during these follow-ups is every 4 months, they would have a structured, semi-structured diagnostic interview assessing for symptoms in the last 4 months of all axis 1 disorders, looking to capture the time when they might have the onset of the first manic or mixed episode. And that was defined as conversion to bipolar I. Since bipolar I diagnosis only requires onset of mania, they did not have to have had a major depressive episode prior to that. Conversion to bipolar II, which would have happened for those 57 participants potentially who had cyclothymia or bipolar NOS diagnosis, was defined as the first onset of the first major depressive episode in presence of a history of hypomanic episode. Basically, they have to have had already hypomanic episode that fits all DSM-4 criteria. And then if after that they develop the major depressive episode, we called that the conversion to bipolar II, since both of those are required. We also had some covariates in our model that are not of interest, like length of follow-up. Obviously, if somebody drops out, we have less data on them, so they have less opportunity to convert. Also, severity of their bipolar symptoms at the start of the study, and whether or not they were seeking treatment. This was not a treatment study, it was a community sample, but however, some of them were seeking out both psychotropic and therapeutic interventions on their own. So what were the actual just rates of conversion during 4.5 years? And I keep stressing that because for me that's a very short time to be. And even though it's not the majority of people, it's still a significant percentage of them are going to have more severe symptoms. So among the 57 with cyclothymia and bipolar NOS, 42% of them have had a conversion to bipolar II. And among those 24, that somehow this is not working now. Okay. Among those 24, 6 went on to convert to bipolar I. So about 10% of the original 57 with this kind of cyclothymia bipolar NOS diagnosis. Among bipolar II individuals, 17 went on to convert to bipolar I. So when we combine those two subgroups, that's a rate of about 15%. This has actually been consistent with a couple of other studies looking at pediatric onset from Pittsburgh and other places where the rates are about 15% for this length of follow-up. So what were the predictors of bipolar I conversion? Earlier age of onset was a significant predictor. So the earlier the first bipolar symptoms started, the more likely they were to have a conversion or worsening course. Also, BAS total scores at the time of the start of the study and their BAS fun-seeking scores predicted conversion to bipolar I. So this sort of sensitivity to reward and specifically the cessation-seeking aspects. Similarly, we had another measure of impulsivity, which is another personality trait questionnaire, and that seemed to also predict, as well as the interaction between threat and reward sensitivity. We also found that BAS hypersensitivity and actually the same subscale, BAS fun-seeking, predicted conversion to bipolar II. So it was predicting both of these worsening course diagnosis. However, the earlier age of onset was only significant for conversion to bipolar I. So that made me start to think, so what is it about this early age of onset that links to the more severe course, and is it something about either neural or behavioral deviations and maturation of the BAS or reward system? So once I got here to Minnesota, I started thinking and working on these questions. And this is probably familiar for a lot of you in the audience, but I'm just going to briefly summarize why adolescence is an important time. There's a lot of neurodevelopment in prefrontal cortical area that's protracted and goes all the way into early 20s. Both white matter changes, gray matter changes, and functional changes when looking at fMRI measures, especially in cognitive control tasks. And it'll become clear while I'm highlighting that. And there's also a normatively hypersensitive reward system. So even healthy adolescents that do not have psychiatric illness seem to be more sensitive to rewards during this time. And one of the prevailing theories that this might be due to a mismatch between the prefrontal cortical maturation that's more protracted and the subcortical regions that respond to rewards that are kind of more fully developed. So does the early bipolar symptom onset actually disrupt these systems? It's hard to tell from the existing data, and part of the reason is that majority of studies of pediatric samples combine children and adolescents in their analysis and do not look at these subgroups separately. So then it's really hard to look at something that would be specific to adolescents. And no studies that I have found have looked at potential deviation in maturational changes, whether looking cross-sectionally in sort of group by age interactions or looking longitudinally and assessing these systems over time. However, adult studies show that bipolar individuals have greater OFC and ventral striatal activation response to reward cues, but it's not clear will this be the pattern when you're looking at the developmental period of hypersensitivity to reward overall, when both healthy controls and adolescents might be exhibiting the same pattern. So this is data based on the first 2 years of the KO1 funded project that I've been doing here, and had 21 individuals with bipolar I or bipolar II or bipolar NOS diagnosis. And I would like to point out that bipolar NOS would be now in DSM-5 bipolar otherwise specified, because most of the time they were getting NOS because of duration of hypomanic periods was less than 4 days. So they were had been hospitalized, often for depression. They had major depressive episodes. They were on psychotropic medications, mood stabilizers. They were receiving treatment, had all kinds of impairments, so they weren't really less severe compared to the two other groups. But half of them had family history in their immediate relatives of bipolar disorder, and most of them were currently on psychotropic medications. And when looking at some of the measures of their symptom levels on the day of the testing, not surprisingly, they reported a higher level of hypomanic and depressive symptoms. The age range was 13 to 19, and there were no differences in age, gender ratio, or race ratio between the two groups of healthy controls and bipolar group. However, bipolar group in this case tended to have significantly lower IQ scores, but they were still in average range or average to high range. So MRI data collection happened at the beginning of the testing day. As I was already showing you on the slide before, we used internal state scales as a brief assessment of their symptoms for the last 24 hours. And then once they were in the scanner, we did a monitor incentive delay task, or MID task, as an assessment of their responses to rewards. This task has 3 runs of 6 minutes each, or approximately 6 minutes. Each run has 60 trials. Some of them are no incentive, meaning they press a button, but they don't get reward or punished. Some of them are gain trials, where they have to press a button when they see a target as quickly as they can to actually win money. Money is the reward. And some of them are loss trials, where they're pressing the button to avoid losing money. So the task in all the trials is always to press the button. So it's in that way simple. It's just the cue tells you whether you'll be able to lose, win, or no change. So what one trial looks like is that there is first a cue signaling what kind of a trial this will be. Circles signal gain or reward trials. A number of lines tells the person whether it's a small, medium, or large reward. And in this case, this is a small reward. Then there is an anticipation period before the target shows up, that's jittered. Then the target shows up for a very brief amount of time, between 180 to 280 milliseconds, and they have to press a button. The duration of the target is adjusted throughout the task to actually maximize their winnings. And we want them to be winning at about 70% of the time. So each run gets either slower or faster depending on how they're doing. Then there is another delay period right before they see their feedback, which will tell them either plus, meaning you won, in this case 25 cents, or you missed, and what's their ongoing total. We focused on the bold signal during these 2 periods of anticipation, the target anticipation period and the feedback anticipation period. The reason we did that is because the recent literature in adults with bipolar disorders has been often talking about differences as they are either anticipating getting reward feedback or as they are preparing to respond. So we wanted to actually look at both of these periods of the task. These are some of the details about the data collection. We did all of our processing in FSL. And as far as the multiple comparison corrections, we used Monte Carlo simulations with a 3D cluster to yield the size of a cluster that would most likely not be due to type 1 error. I will present data on the 2 contrasts of interest that were kind of the most interesting ones. So combining all of the reward or gain trials versus neutral trials when they're not winning or losing during both target anticipation period, and again, all gain trials versus neutral trials during the feedback anticipation. The statistical models had multiple predictors, but the 2 main predictors of interest were the bipolar group versus controls and age by group interaction to look at those differences in potential maturational changes. There were no group differences in behavioral performance, which is not surprising because we adjusted it for each individual. So they should be all successful, and the mean was 74%, so the task worked. So what about the target anticipation period? Okay. So what we found is that control group showed greater activation than the bipolar group in right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex area and left precuneus area. And the DLPFC in particular was interesting because that's an area of cognitive control. We did not find any areas with greater activation for bipolar group versus controls. So this was actually contrary to our original hypothesis. And there were no significant age by group interactions. What about the anticipation of the feedback? So again, right dorsolateral prefrontal cortical area was significant, and again, it was increased activation in control group, going from anticipating a neutral feedback versus anticipating a reward feedback, and increased activation in orbital frontal cortex and the left precuneus. We also found a significant age by group interaction, and it was in a very interesting region, the right inferior frontal gyrus region, which is involved in response inhibition. So to remind you, this is during the time they've completed their response and they're waiting for feedback. And what we found in the bipolar group is that basically older participants were activating this region more than younger, or with older age there was greater activation. And in the control group, there was an opposite direction significant finding, where with older age controls were engaged in this region less. So there seems to be some sort of maturational difference where, while healthy controls don't need to be working as hard maybe to using this cognitive control region while they're anticipating feedback and they have ceased responding, for bipolar individuals, this seems to be more and more being engaged with time. So this is just kind of summarizing the data. The majority of our findings that were kind of most interesting and hanging together were in the cognitive control regions. We found that adolescents with bipolar disorder exhibited lower activation both during target anticipation and during feedback anticipation compared to healthy controls. There was age by group interaction in the region involved in response inhibition. And additionally, this is data that I didn't present. We also found age by group interaction in precuneus region when it came to responding or to different magnitudes of reward, where basically with age there was a significant positive relationship in healthy controls, where this region was getting more activated with older healthy controls, and for the bipolar group there was no age association. We did not find group differences in ventral striatum, which was disappointing at first, but I'm going to show you just some very preliminary data. And one thing to say about that, the way I'm interpreting it is because this is a developmentally hypersensitive period for rewards, so potentially part of the reason is that maybe we're having both groups being just hypersensitive, and that's why we're not seeing group differences. But when we took 18 of those participants have completed their 12-month follow-up, where basically they come in and we assessed using structured diagnostic interview the severity of their symptoms over time, that we found that nucleus accumbens reactivity during target anticipation to rewards actually predicted more severe symptoms during the follow-up of mania. So that's interesting, especially given this is an interviewer-based rating. Who does not know what their nucleus accumbens looks like? So, but it's very preliminary because we're still collecting the data, and there's still more to do with that. So I'm going to have last set of findings to present you, because this was all about neural development, but what about behaviorally? We looked at delayed discounting for several reasons. This is a decision-making task that actually shows maturational changes during adolescence. And what delayed discounting taps into is the preference for smaller but immediate rewards versus larger but delayed rewards. And in normative samples, we have found that healthy teens, as they age or the older they get, they will wait longer for that larger reward as opposed to taking the smaller one right now. It's also a behavioral measure that taps into prefrontal cortical functioning. I mean, the neural substrates of this task are not fully known, and there is some debate in the literature, but definitely this is one of the regions that's being talked about as being significant for this performance. And there is some support in adult literature, actually 2 studies to date, that adults with bipolar disorder have steeper delayed discounting, which means greater preference for immediate smaller rewards than delayed larger rewards compared to healthy adults. But to my knowledge, there was no data on adolescents with bipolar disorder. So the age range for these analyses was a little bit larger. It was 13 to 23. So we really captured the full adolescence and going into young adulthood. There were no differences in age, sex ratio, race ratio, or IQ for this particular subset. There was 38 individuals with bipolar diagnosis and 40 healthy controls. And that's some of the same information I presented before. This computer task was administered so after the MRI data collection, but on the same day of the testing. And they would be, basically what involved is responding to a series of questions. They would ask them questions like this. Would you rather have $5 now or $10 in 10 days? Would you rather have $8 now or $10 in 30 days? $10 with in X amount of days was always constant. What changed is the value or the magnitude of the immediate reward, and it was changing based on their responses until it got to the point where we'll take the immediate money now. So somebody who has a less of a delayed discounting will maybe wait until it gets to $9.5 and then go like, okay, I'll have it now because the difference is so small. Somebody who has steeper delayed discounting will go, I'll take the $1 now. I don't want to wait. So we took the values for the immediate smaller rewards, plotted it against delays, against 1 to 10 days, 30 days, 180 days, and 365 days, so it's a year. And then calculated the area under the curve as sort of a theoretical measure describing the discounting. And one note is smaller the area under the curve, the steeper the discounting, or the more the preference for smaller but immediate money. So what we found is a significant age by group interaction. And what we found is, first of all, on that right panel over there, controls had what you would expect and what other studies have found, which is with older age, they waited longer for the larger rewards, and that was significant. In our bipolar group, there was no change with age. So they did not exhibit any maturational changes. Also, what's important to note is even though it was a statistically not significant trend, there was still a trend for bipolar group to be having steeper discounting, so preferring more immediate and smaller amounts of money as opposed to delayed and larger. We did not find this pattern in probability discounting. Not going into all the details of it, but it's another risk-taking measure where they're asked, would you like $5 for sure or $10 with 50% chance? So we didn't find any effects. So it seems to be really specific to delay discounting. And the general response inhibition measure that doesn't have any rewards, the go-no-go task, we did not find any age by group interactions there either. So this seems to be specific to this process. So to summarize, I showed a lot of data, but there seems to be evidence from our group and from other people that there is BAS hypersensitivity in individuals with bipolar disorder. There also seems to be evidence for BAS hypersensitivity predicting worsening course and conversion to bipolar I at early age of onset, predicting this conversion with prospective data. And I would call this preliminary evidence for deviation and maturation of this system for individuals who already have onset of symptoms. I'm mainly saying preliminary because it's cross-sectional. We need to really look at longitudinal data and compare changes across time for the two groups to rule out potential group by cohort effects. And what's also important, it seems to be really in the cognitive control region, which is honestly not what I was expecting. So I was first not as excited about the findings, but now it's starting to make more sense that this protracted development somehow is getting derailed for individuals who already have bipolar symptoms. So what's the clinical implication of all of that? So one could be that there is different mechanisms that result in bipolar symptoms based on when illness onsets. If a system that's been shown to be important for bipolar disorder is not fully developed and you start having symptoms of bipolar illness, that might be meaning that there's a different neural mechanism that leads to those symptoms than for somebody who has onset in adulthood. Or it could be that the mechanism driving symptoms changes with age within the same person. In either case, that would suggest different targets for interventions, either based on age of the individual or age of onset. But in order to know which one it should be, we need more data. So what kind of data I would like to get? Well, some of the data is ongoing progress of trying to collect and bring back everybody into the lab and see, do any of these deviations actually predict prospective course? Other data would be to look longitudinally at neural and behavioral changes in BAS functioning or reward system functioning. And Dr. Cullen is a co-investigator on a grant we submitted. We're hoping to get to do that. There's other kind of questions I would like to answer in adults. For example, I mean, there's a lot of data about BAS hypersensitivity, but that's a very large system. So what specifically, when we're looking at neural functioning, maps the best onto the severity of symptoms? because that might start to tell us something about mechanisms to target with interventions. And also having direct comparisons of people who had either adult or pediatric onset of illness to see, is there, basically, should age of onset be something that we're concerned about when we're treating them, or is it just their current age? So there's a lot of collaborators, a lot of different places. The ones that are starred were either currently or in the past mentors of mine, and greatly appreciated. And there's also numerous research staff that did a lot of this work and collected a lot of this data, both UW-Madison, Temple University, and here. And I'd like to thank all the research participants that contributed to the studies. And finally, my funding support, and I do not have any conflict of interest to disclose. And thank you. So we have, I maybe talked fast, but we have plenty of time for questions.
If anyone has any questions, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone. I think I'll start. Oh, Kelvin. No, I wanted to just. My question was about. So you had. I really like your progression of research. Thank you for this. It's really a fantastic line of work over the past several years. So it's really exciting to hear it presented here in psychiatry and see where it's going. So you had talked about how these. You know, we deal clinically with a lot of these kids who are kind of the soft, maybe having some subthreshold symptoms and what could be going on with them. And I think that's really neat. But I think some of the other groups that have looked at offspring of bipolar parents have found kind of a different progression where they find like early first presentations being anxiety disorders, and wanted to know what you thought about that, or is that just like even farther back than what you're looking at? Or
that's actually interesting. I'll show you then. Thank you for that question. I'll show you the slide of BIS by BAS interaction predicting conversion to bipolar I from the UW-Madison data set. And what that interaction said is that the people who were high on both were more likely to experience conversion to bipolar I. And I think it goes back to, this is, I might have to go like this. I think it goes back to that figure. Here it is. The reward system does not exist in vacuum, and there is a lot of interactions with stress hormones and basically more classically thought of as like anxiety or stress or threat systems. So basically and there is some like basic science research to suggest that experiencing stress can affect your reward responsiveness and things like that. So is it a different subgroup? Potentially, but does that mean that it has nothing to do with reward system? I'm not sure. It could be that you have this hypersensitivity to threat that somehow then impacts how you also respond to rewards. And that's, for whatever developmental reason, shows up earlier than you would see the bipolar symptoms. I think that's very interesting data. And I've heard it specified and talked about in now, like, I think 3 different countries. So it's real, but I haven't heard a lot of people saying, like, what's the mechanism for this? And this would be my stab at where I would go with that, is to look and measure both, maybe like looking at cortisol and looking at some sort of measures of reward system and seeing, are they somehow over time changing together? Or is there something where you become more sensitive to one and then it increases your risks and deviations in the other?
Dr. Lim had a question.
Snezana, this is a great study looking at basically who's going to develop into more severe forms of affective disorder. There's a lot of comorbidity oftentimes we see in adults in terms of bipolar disorder and substance use, which makes sense when you present your data in terms of the BIS and BAS. Do you have any information about substance use on your subjects, and how does it relate to this aspect? Because we've been working on analyses looking at longitudinal changes in substance users, adolescent substance users. So I'm just curious.
Okay. So in the adolescent study, the Minnesota sample, it was high, meaning I don't honestly have the exact number in mind. I think for this subset, it was about half had a substance abuse, usually not dependence because they're young. It was the usual typical cannabis, alcohol, drugs, not necessarily heavy drugs because they're still young. And I think it's an access issue. But we did look at, for this functional or imaging data, when we exclude those individuals, I mean, it's like less of a much smaller sample. It cuts it by half. I think it becomes like 10 or 11 of the participants in the bipolar spectrum and comparing them to healthy controls and finding similar patterns. So it doesn't seem to be driven by the substance use comorbidity. We also did the same thing, excluding individuals with comorbid ADHD, which is, comorbidity is really high in this sample too, and they have anxiety disorders and all these other things. And because we wanted to, those were the two that we were most concerned about because of, cognitive control, prefrontal, some of the attentional systems are showing up. Is that due to basically having a comorbid ADHD people, ADHD symptoms? When we excluded those, we still found similar pattern of findings, so it didn't seem to be completely, the cluster sizes shifted slightly, but the pattern of the finding was the same. So it made me more confident it's not due to comorbidity. But it's hard to find people without comorbidity. That's like, it's hard to find them, period.
Thanks for that talk.
Thank you.
It's really interesting to hear it framed the way that you're framing it. And I'm curious, do you get any clinical history of adverse childhood experiences for these kids?
We don't have like questionnaire or interview assessments of all of the possibilities, but we do ask about trauma, and because we do a kitty SADS L with them, which ask about traumatic experiences. I know that for sure there is a significant rate of traumatic experiences like abuse of different kind, as well as observing or seeing violent death. I mean,
does that mediate anything of these results? Because I imagine that would also skew your reward system from an earlier age.
That's interesting. I haven't looked specifically into that analysis, but we could. I haven't looked because there's two different kinds of analysis you could do. You could look at people who actually exhibit symptoms in response to trauma, or you could just look at experienced trauma as defined by the case-SO, which is not exhaustive, but a pretty thorough set.
And just building on that way I ask is that there's a fair amount of literature looking at average childhood experiences in the pathway to progression for substance use disorders in terms of adolescence and going through with similar data framed in a little different way. I haven't seen this specific type of thing. Mm-hmm. So in terms of building off of what Dr. Lim's question came from, it's very similar mechanisms that there's already grounding for that within adverse childhood experiences leading down the same pathway.
Yeah. So we can definitely look at that. And I know one of the things that we were systematically asking them about because of the concerns with reporting and stuff is like what age of experiencing traumas. So we would have that kind of timeline information.
On the slide that's on the board, fourth from the bottom is positive family history for bipolar at 47%. Would you comment about that? Impressions were that very high positive family history. In fact, sometimes back it was like you didn't make a diagnosis unless you found a positive family history. Your comments?
So this was assessing for family history only in grandparents, parents, and siblings. So only immediate family members. So it doesn't mean necessarily the others don't have somebody in their family. It's just we used the family history interview that only asks about those relatives, and we also worried about, that data. For example, we ask parents that information, but oftentimes they know about them and their family, but they're like paternal grandparents, I don't know, because it's usually a mom that comes in. So, so what do I think about that? I think it's still pretty high, and I can say that the one group that's usually the most questioned is the NOS group, and majority of them had a family history. So it wasn't like the more severe ones were reporting parent with. And even the ones who did not have bipolar disorder history, they did have depression. So they had an affective disorder family history, but maybe not just necessarily bipolar disorder.
It's a question I've been wondering about lately. How common is it that people present with bipolar disorder with no family history, with just a spontaneous first in the family presentation? And I wonder if it's more common, because I think we do tend to reserve our diagnoses for those with a family history, and that's probably why those people even got bipolar NOS diagnoses, because they were kind of fuzzy, but they had a family history. Mm-hmm. And so the clinicians were clinician leans towards including in the diagnosis, whereas we wouldn't, if they had no family history, we probably wouldn't diagnose them unless they had full-blown bipolar disorder.
So some of the things that the data suggests is that what are some of the risk factors for bipolar disorder is early age of onset of major depression. So if we're looking at somebody age 9 and 10 to have major depression, there's
higher risk.
Yeah, and also history of recurrent major depression in the family. So that maybe we need to expand what we consider as a family history. Like, is there a significant history of affective disorders, even if they're not bipolar necessarily? So there's other kinds of things, and it's a very controversial question. I've been working with Eric Janstrom, who's probably spent the most time of his research, because it's all about pediatric assessment of bipolar disorder and what are the best predictors, and using all kinds of statistical models and all kinds of data. And there was a meta-analysis that they did of epidemiological studies across different countries and things, and basically ruled out it's not a cohort effect, it's not a cultural phenomena. There seems to be something real, and it's always harder to identify if it's an adult or a kid, the less severe condition. So hypomania, because oftentimes, unless the kid is doing something at school where it's disruptive or is very violent, nobody's really complaining about a kid being a little bit giddy, or they just think, oh, they're just like a hyper kid, or they're very exuberant. So it's only when it becomes so extreme that it's affecting the family that they might bring it up. In adults, oftentimes adults, if they experience only hypomania, they don't present with that in clinic, because they don't come in and say, oh, I have these times when I'm feeling really great, and I catch up on all the work I didn't do while I was depressed, and I'm feeling on top of the world, and everybody loves me, or at least they think everybody loves them. so they don't, or when they get on medications, and if that goes away, they stop medications because they miss it. So it's kind of, I think this is, for me, it was like the one time where having a disorder could be also a positive change in functioning, which is what hypomania can be like. And that's a shift, because we're usually talking to people, oh, you're distressed by this. So that's, I mean, it's a really long, and I maybe went on tangents, but I feel like there's multiple reasons for why that would be. And it's hard in the clinic with like really short amount of time to make the best diagnosis.
Well, we've gotten ourselves right up to the hour. I want to thank Snezana one more time for a really fantastic talk. Thank you.
I've answered. I just kind of started rambling. That's great. Thank you.